One of the things when you go to Arizona State University and you major in history, you have to do a lot of self-teaching. And studying American history, that's definitely something you got to do. One of the questions that I would ask, because almost everybody here, we were always taught about the Federalists. Everyone you see in the media, for Glenn Beck, perfect example, read the Federalist Papers. You know, read what they said, the Constitution, the Constitution, the Constitution, and we talk about it. And that's a very important thing, obviously, we have to talk about. So when I first stumbled on the point that there were actually people who did not think that the Constitution was a good idea, I asked why. If I'd asked my college professor, it would have been because they were white slave-owning people who didn't care. So I skipped my professor. And I went, and I actually found a very interesting book called the Anti-Federalist Papers and the Constitutional Convention Debates, which was a book written by a guy named Ralph Ketchum. Really interesting. If you have any trouble reading small print, then get a telescope or something, because it's very small, but an incredible book nonetheless. So the first question I ask is, where are really the Federalists? Who are the Anti-Federalists? And I'll run through a quick list of the major supporters from both sides. Federalists you'll be a lot more familiar with than the Anti-Federalists. Really, your number one cheerleader for the Federalist cause was Alexander Hamilton. Along with Alexander Hamilton, he had great help from James Madison, John Jay. Anyone, raise your hand if you're familiar with John Jay. Okay, right, not many people. John Jay, as a quick synopsis, was probably our first major successful diplomat. He was really, his expertise was on foreign affairs. Also was John Adams, George Washington, and Benjamin Franklin. Now my attitude was, God help whoever decided to argue against that all-star team. And then I found out that the Anti-Federalists had, besides Patrick Henry, a man by the name of Richard Henry Lee out of the state of Virginia, a man by the name of Melancton Smith out of New York, Robert Yates, stop me when you know any of these names, James Monroe, Mercy Otis Warren, who's an interesting story I'll get into in a second, and with a big asterisk next to his name, Thomas Jefferson. And the reason I say big asterisk is because Thomas Jefferson, during the constitutional debate, is actually over in France. And seeing is that he didn't have one of these that he could just whip out of his pocket and give everybody his opinion, his involvement was really minimalistic. In fact, actually, when he finally came back from France, because he was over in Europe, but when he came back from France, you got to remember, 1789 is when we're having our constitutional debate. Over in France, they're killing people in their own revolution. He comes back to the States and he actually finds what we're doing very boring. He actually once told John Adams that he was actually very depressed that all we were talking about was the Treasury Department and proportional representation. So basically, the key points of the Federalists, going into the convention, here's the thing, when we met in Philadelphia, the original intention of meeting in Philadelphia was not to actually create a constitution that we think of. It was originally meant to amend and rectify deficiencies that were seen in the Articles of Confederation. Now, the Articles of Confederation pretty much was a system modeled after the Iroquois Confederacy, which was seen by people, among which was Benjamin Franklin, as a very functioning style of government, because it recognized the need for a local community to be able to come together when necessary, but also respect the sovereignty and uniqueness of the individuals that made up that union. So whereas the Iroquois were 6 different tribes, the United States were 13 separate states. So the Articles of Confederation had largely a system of loosely united, mostly sovereign states. There were some issues that came up that were brought up by people like Alexander Hamilton, 2 of which, one was the Whiskey Rebellion. How many people are familiar with that? Okay. And the second one was Shays' Rebellion, which was the bigger and more important of the 2. Shays' Rebellion was in western Massachusetts, and that was an instance where you had a bunch of Revolutionary War veterans. Okay, now, if there's almost, and as we salute all veterans, I would say that if there's any group of veterans you would think would not have a problem with the government, or the government wouldn't pick a problem with, it would be the veterans that created the country. But what ended up happening is these Revolutionary War soldiers, they had fought in the Revolution, 1776 to 1781. Well, while they're out there freezing in Valley Forge and fighting in Yorktown and doing all of this stuff, what they're not doing is paying taxes on the land they own in western Massachusetts. After the war, government then, as it does now, does not forget money owed. So there was this problem. The government wanted these back taxes. The veterans said no. The veterans got together. The veterans said, we're not going to pay, we're going to march. And the central government under the Articles of Confederation said, this is no good, let's raise an army, to which case then the question was asked, what army? We don't have one. So then they go to the governor of Massachusetts, and they say, we need you to raise a militia, something. That worked. So they raised this militia. Now, George Washington, who was involved and employed, and the rebellion was stopped. I think it was about 3 or 4 people got injured, maybe 1 person, I think it was, who died. It was not a big blow-up, but it was very symbolic. So the Federalists, when we have the convention, Alexander Hamilton brings with him a couple proposed amendments and changes to the Articles of Confederation. Now those proposals and those changes and those modifications are what we now know as the Constitution. Pretty much the basic bullet points of understanding what the Federalists wanted is the following. They wanted an energetic central government. This was Alexander's wording, not mine, it was his. He believed that we needed a more energetic central government. We needed a currency controlled by the central government. Because the one thing you don't want to do is go from Maine to New Jersey and have to change the currency every time. And, if I want to buy something for $3 New York dollars, what is that in Virginia currency? And these were questions they had. They wanted the federal government to have the ability to actually tax the states. Because they said if the central government is responsible for certain things that the states are not going to be responsible for, how are we going to do that? And if you're going to be the beneficiary of it, you should pay us. The federal government would maintain a national army. Now, at the time, this was a very controversial issue. Because in most of the world, a national army really existed for 2 things. Either 1, taking land that belonged to someone else, or 2, it was used largely as a national police force on steroids. When the people of France challenged the authority of the French king, he did not just call in his local magistrates and his local police force. He called in the cannons, he called in the troops, he called in the cavalry. It was the French army against the French people. Only the king then did not expect the army to join the people. And they believed that you had to have 3 branches of government: your executive, your legislative, your judiciary. Now, here was a big stickler, and this is really what got the Anti-Federalists into the debate as vigorous as they got into it. They believed that the rights of the individual were assumed in their Constitution, and that a Bill of Rights was not necessary. They said, everyone knows what rights we're talking about. If you know it, what do we need to talk about it for? It's just understood. Your Anti-Federalist came from almost a very opposite position. And it was not a position at first of saying, well, let's take their new proposal of this Constitution and tweak their Constitution. Their original point was, no, let's just tweak the Articles of Confederation. Let's stick with the government that worked. And here's why they believed that. At the time of our independence in 1781, when Britain finally said no more, and you have the United States, with the exception of Russia, we were larger than any other country in terms of territory, compared to any country in Europe. We were a generation away from having a larger population than any country in Europe. We had more access to natural resources than any individual country in Europe. And the Anti-Federalist said, on top of all of that, so it's not because we need, your Constitution isn't going to create more wealth necessarily, isn't going to create any more than we already have. We're already the most blessed country on the planet. They said the other big thing to remember before you get rid of this confederation is that this confederation happened to just win a war against the biggest, most powerful empire in the world. Why is this system of government a failure? Because, and that was the question they asked. What in this experiment so far has failed? Other than the central government's inability to put together a force to go up against a couple farmers in western Massachusetts. That was the question Patrick Henry asked. So the Anti-Federalist said you need a very weak government. Not incompetent, which we got anyway as a bonus prize, but you need a weak central government. And by weak, what they meant by the word weak is not incompetent and not unable to do things, but very limited in what exactly those responsibilities would be. They believed, obviously, in a confederation of mostly independent states based on the Articles of Confederation, and that they believed that the three-branch model of government was too easily corruptible. Now, there's going to be a point right about now where this is going to start to sound very prophetic. They said that the more local power, the easier it was for the citizens to protect their rights. And what they believed is this. They actually got this dead right, in my opinion, and that is that government cannot chew gum and walk at the same time. And they said the following: as a government, you have a choice to make. You can either create a government that is going to focus on national projects, national wealth, national prestige, compete with the empires of Europe, or you're going to have a government that is there to serve and protect the rights and liberties and opportunities of the individual. They did not believe you could do those two things at the same time, because they believed that if you want to pursue national endeavors, you are going to have to trample on some of the rights of the people to get to those national endeavors. Healthcare, other issues, education,
gun rights,
all these things. Okay? You want to start thinking nationally, these are issues that are going to come up. And they said, as proposed on day one, the Constitution had no safeguards against the rights of the people being dissolved. The Federalists, their first response actually tested very poorly, and that was they said, well, of course the people's rights aren't going to be dissolved, don't be stupid. That's a paraphrase, no one actually said that. Everybody here has probably heard, if not from Shane or not from some other person locally, you've probably heard from Glenn Beck or someone who said, read the Federalist Papers. I'm not going to ask how many of you have read it. How many of you have been told to read them? Everybody's saying it can go up. Well, the Federalists did something very smart that the Anti-Federalists didn't do, and that was they got organized. Now, raise your hand if you belong to a Tea Party and you feel like that's sort of how come we keep getting hit over the head, is because someone else is organized and we're not. Right. Federalists did something interesting. If you read the Federalist Papers, you will realize that they're broken down into sections, although it doesn't say that. The first 14 papers cover the need for a strong union to provide security and prosperity. Now, you can be a cynic in politics and say that, well, if you can go up to any group of people and you can promise them wealth and safety, you've got their vote and their support. And there's about 10,000 years worth of human history that says you'd be onto something. Got papers 15 through 22. Now, first, what they've done, the first 14 papers, is that they actually have built up why their Constitution is the right way to go forward. 15 to 22 explains to you why the Articles of Confederation were a failure. Now, the Federalist Papers, by the way, are written largely by three people. Alexander Hamilton, who took the lead on it, James Madison, and John Jay. Now, Alexander Hamilton, funny story because this has nothing to do with philosophy or ideas or anything. Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, when they were putting together the Federalist Papers, decided that Alexander Hamilton was actually going to be the face of the Federalist Papers, which is why most people say that Alexander Hamilton wrote all 85 of them. And he did not. But, just to prove that the more things change, the more they stay the same, James Madison was a very smart man, incredibly smart man. He was about 5'1", slightly overweight, kind of balding, squeaky voice. Alexander Hamilton, average height for his time, considered very attractive, very popular within American high society. He became the face of the movement. That's just how it was. Actually, Alexander Hamilton is also the protagonist of the very first American political sex scandal, which is interesting. I'll get into that a little later as this develops. But yes, Alexander Hamilton, and I believe, and I have to agree with Shane, and yes, Thomas Jefferson was very smart. Alexander Hamilton would have given Thomas Jefferson a run for his money on the SATs. I'll just say that. Papers 23 through 36 talk about the powers required for a more energetic union. 37 to 51, the Constitutional Convention and defining the new Federalist system. They are attacking this in a very organized way. They're building up their argument. 52 through 83 analyzes the three branches of government. Papers 52 to 61 discuss the House of Representatives and federal elections. The Senate is covered in 62 to 66. The executive from 67 to 77, and the judiciary from 78 to 83. And papers 84 and 85 basically were written to say that if you still have any questions about this, just vote for it because it's the right way to go forward.
Gee, that sounds like Obama.
So, there are three major Federalist Papers that are often quoted and often talked about when creating the need for the Constitution. First is Federalist Paper number 9, with the title, The Utility of the Union as a Safeguard Against the Domestic Faction and Insurrection. Now, in case you're wondering, the Federalist Papers were not written as a book. They were articles submitted to the editor of newspapers in the States where they believed that the Constitution was most in danger of not being ratified by the state legislatures. Most of the papers were written in the state of New York. Most of them are written to the citizens of the state of New York. New York had the second largest anti-federalist movement, and really, honestly, coming from that part of the country, I can say that since then it's been downhill. And it's kind of sad. Basically, a quick summary. Federalist Paper number 9 says that a strong union is the best way to ensure the safety of the states from domestic insurrection and political regionalism. Domestic insurrection was a major concern of the Federalists, because the one thing you don't want to do is overthrow a tyrannical government and leave people with the opportunity maybe to do the same thing down the road if it were to happen again. But John Adams also happened to believe that if you overthrew a monarchy, that was legal and that was within your right, your natural right to do it, to overthrow a monarchy. he believed to overthrow a Republican government was treasonous. He wrote that during the Shays Rebellion. This is President number 2, by the way, and we're getting there. Number 10, a large and populous republic, this is Federalist Paper number 10, written by James Madison. A large and populous republic is the best protection against the effects of political factions. Now, this is one of the most heralded of the Federalist Papers. This is the one where we always talk about the fact that political parties, the Republicans, Democrats, Whigs, that they've created this factionalism that has helped chip away at the country. And I'm not saying that there's no negative to that point. There is none. Okay? Now, we can discuss whether or not, I mean, look, our founding fathers could never conceive of a country of over 320 million people. Okay? James Madison, I'd imagine, not that I've spoken to him, would probably have thought in his own mind, had you asked him back in 1789, was 320 million people enough people that you'd avoid factionalism? He probably, I'd imagine, would say yes. I think. I don't know. And then number 48, written by Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton, and this is funny, because this was one of those moments where if you had YouTube back then, he would have definitely shot himself in the foot. More than words on paper will be needed to prevent the concentration of power in the hands of a few. That's interesting because Alexander Hamilton kind of stuck his neck out very, very far to get this Constitution passed. The Anti-Federalist response, a lot more chaotic, a lot less organized, and a lot harder to keep track of. One of the reasons why I believe, at least, that they were less successful than they could have been. There's speeches given by a man who went by the name of John DeWitt. No one knows exactly what his name is. John DeWitt, for those very few people, probably me and maybe one or two other people, John DeWitt is the name of a Dutch nationalist who participated in the Dutch overthrow of the Spanish government 200 years before the American Revolution. Now, funny enough, when John Adams was our ambassador to the Netherlands, he was once asked why the Dutch, who were at that point one of the largest economies in the world, why they should extend credit to the colonies who were at war with Britain. Now, back at that time, a great reason was we're at war with Britain, because Britain, at the time of the Revolutionary War, by the way, was at war with a couple countries, the Netherlands being one of them. Well, John Adams kind of stuck his foot in his mouth by saying, well, we propose to bring about a republican form of government, the likes of which the world has never seen. That would work except for the fact that you are speaking to the lone republican government in Europe. We ended up getting the credit. But I'll tell you, here's something, if you do have a pen, write this down. If you look up the Dutch Act of Abjuration of, easy for me to remember, 1581, if you take that act and you take our Declaration of Independence and you put them on top of each other, I'll go out on a limb and assume that Thomas Jefferson read that before he wrote the Declaration of Independence. Now, so, John DeWitt was a known political name, it was a pen name. He wrote 3 papers talking about government of the people and the need for a Bill of Rights. Remember, the Constitution as originally proposed did not have a Bill of Rights. Now, because he didn't want to write them down, he only spoke it, Patrick Henry gave 2 speeches at the Virginia Ratification Convention on June 5th and June 7th of 1788. I'm going to read a little later. Actually, I'll read now just so it sounds a little more prophetic. This is what Patrick Henry said about changing from the Confederated government that we had to the Constitution pre-Bill of Rights. Remember, the Constitution did not have a Bill of Rights yet. Patrick Henry said, "I shall be told I am continually afraid. But, sir," he was speaking to the head of the convention, "I have strong cause of apprehension. In some parts of this Constitution before you, the great rights of free men are endangered. In other parts, absolutely taken away. How does your trial by jury stand? In civil cases, it is gone, and not sufficiently secured in criminal. This best privilege is gone. But we are told that we need not fear, because those in power, being our representatives, will not abuse the powers we put in their hands. I am not well versed in history, but I will submit to your recollection whether liberty has been destroyed most often by the licentiousness of the people or by the tyranny of rulers. I imagine, sir, you will find the balance on the side of tyranny. Happy will you be if you miss the fate of those nations who, omitting to resist their oppressors or negligently suffering their liberty to be wrested from them, have groaned under intolerable despotism." Now, in short, that's Patrick Henry pretty much just saying, give this some real thought. Part of what the Federalist said was you don't have to worry. The people in power will not abuse it because they understand what it took them to get it. Now, Patrick Henry would be the first one to say, I'm not questioning George Washington's principles. Okay? Now, I'm going to make this up because he wasn't this prophetic. Okay? But God knows what's going to happen by the time we get to number 44. But that's what you have, are those issues, those concerns. Melancton Smith from New York gave speeches on June 20th and June 27th, 1788, imploring upon the state of New York to not adopt the Constitution and not vote on it until there was a Bill of Rights that were added to it. Sentinel number 1, there was a guy who wrote as Sentinel. No one really knows who he was, but he wrote a paper about responsibility and checks and self-government. Another person writing under the name of Brutus, 1 through 16, talked about a couple interesting issues that he had with the Constitution, mainly loss of personal liberties, legislating from the courts, danger of the necessary and proper clause, Congress will abuse the ability to tax and borrow against the credit of the nation, representatives and senators will abuse not having term limits, and they also said if you're going to actually have slaves count in how many representatives a state will have, then at least give the slaves the right to vote. That was dead on arrival. And they said that it should be more than just committing a crime, that you should be allowed to remove a judge from his position. You can't make this kind of prophecy up. And then you had the federal farmer, who talked about the effect that it would have on your rural communities, the way it was, papers 1 and 2. By the way, when we talk about gun rights as conservative or as a Tea Party movement, one of the big issues today are gun rights. The idea of the Second Amendment, as we know about it today, gun rights was one of those understood rights. I mean, the Federalists said, look, if you didn't have the right to have a gun, we wouldn't have won the revolution. So of course, no one's going to ever, and that's where you stop them. No one's going to ever. I happen to personally believe if we brought all of our founding fathers back, especially the Anti-Federalists, I think a lot of them would be shocked that we made it this far. Me personally. Richard Henry Lee, who is a relative of Robert E. Lee, much older though, had an interesting quote because he happened to be he is the grandfather, so to say, of your Second Amendment. Now, he would argue that the Second Amendment we adopted, how many people believe the Second Amendment is without question easy to understand as long as you're not some progressive socialist who hates guns? Now what if I told you that Richard Henry Lee was furious that they watered down what he wanted as the Second Amendment? Richard Henry Lee said the following, and quote, about your gun rights: to preserve liberty, it is essential that the whole body of the people always possess arms and be taught alike, especially when young, how to use them.
I agree.
Now, he was considered by some, at least the Virginia Convention, to be a moderate. Patrick Henry, who unfortunately in American history is remembered for saying two things, and only two things, really only one thing if you don't really follow it, and which is the famous "give me liberty, give me death." We don't even give him the credit that that was part of the speech he was given. At least when we hear Abraham Lincoln say 7 years ago, we all say Gettysburg Address. I mean, we hear "give me liberty, give me death." We don't even act like, we just act like he just got up and said it and walked away and went for sabbatical. Patrick Henry also famously said, at the ratification convention, guard with jealous attention the public liberty. Suspect everyone who approaches that jewel. And then you had Brutus, who no one quite knows exactly who he is, just named himself after A2 Brute. Again, it's prophetic. The new system, the Constitution, will grow larger and larger if we do not define what promote the general welfare means. Now, the Federalists, and not to put them down because they did, as Shane said, had we stuck to what was eventually passed, we would avoid a number of problems. Okay? So then you get to the point where you actually get to the actual nitty-gritty debate, the convention, the politics, as Otto von Bismarck once said, the sausage making, that if you actually saw it, you wouldn't ever want to be involved in it. And I can tell you that there are times when you're involved in politics where, I will admit, there are slight times when you're dealing with some of these people, either on your own side and on the other side, where sometimes you think, we need stronger gun rights. Because sometimes you feel like just you can't negotiate sometimes with these people. But that's a personal note. Federalists. They wanted a vote on the Constitution without amendments. That was their big thing in the convention, in the debate. We do not want the Bill of Rights. They said they would discuss amendments only if the states insisted on them. Now, in 8 of the 13 states, the Federalists had minimal to no opposition. So the Constitution, in and of itself, was going to be adopted. Now, the votes needed, because remember, you only needed 3/4 of the states. And when you have 13, and most of them are already in your pocket, this is an easy vote to win. Because the votes already came in to ratify the Constitution before some states even had their conventions vote. But 3 states kind of stuck out, and this is where the Anti-Federalists put all their money in, to 3 states: New York, Massachusetts, and Virginia. The Anti-Federalists wanted to put off a vote in all states until there was a Constitution with amendments to vote on. They lost that. So basically what they did was they made sure that New York, Massachusetts, and Virginia had conditional acceptance of the Constitution based on future amendments. And that kind of angered Alexander Hamilton because the United States at that time, without Virginia, Massachusetts, and New York, was a very feeble country. Congratulations, you're now the federal government of practically nothing. Most of your population doesn't even live in those states. You needed these 3 states. So in that regard, the Anti-Federalists had positioned themselves very well. The Massachusetts Ratification Convention happened on February 6, 1788. It was a split convention. It was about 50-50. The Federalists were led at the Massachusetts Convention by John Hancock, another big name. The Anti-Federalists had found probably the biggest loudmouth they could, and in Boston that's impressive. That was Samuel Adams. So at least in that instance, you actually did have two big, at least bigger names, butting heads. It was the first convention. Massachusetts was the first state to actually make recommendations to fix the Constitution. They made 9 recommendations to change the Constitution. And it was the first state to clarify the rights the Anti-Federalists feared were going to be lost. So here are Massachusetts recommendations. 1, powers not explicitly granted in the Constitution are reserved to the states. One representative for every 30,000 people. Nowadays, in case you're wondering, it's about 750,000 people per congressional district. Now, the last thing I'm advocating for is adding another 100 congressmen. I'm not saying that. It's just two changes. Congress should only enforce necessary and proper clause if a state refuses to do what is needed first. Which would be an interesting little change. Congress should not tax the individual citizen if the federal government runs out of money. The Federalists originally said, if we run out of money, not that that's going to happen, but if we did, we then would reserve the right to go to the individuals to collect a special tax to get us over the hump. Anti-Federalists said, no. You should go to the state first and ask for extra funding. And it was asked the state. The state was not mandated to do this. The federal government effectively, as a 17-year-old, would go to dad and say, I maxed out the credit card, but I promised my girlfriend we'd go to Hawaii. Can you please pay for it? And then it was the state that would say yes or no. If they were like my father, I'd have had to go wash dishes. Congress should not create a company of merchants with exclusive advantages. Now, this was important at that time because in Britain you had the British East India Company. It was common for governments in Europe to fund companies that would go out to promote the interests, and that's how the British basically took over India with hardly ever having to fire a shot. No one should be put to death or suffer a severe punishment without first being indicted by a grand jury. Now, we take that so for granted, but the Federalists actually said that's a right that's understood. Okay? The Supreme Court does not get involved in a case between two people from different states in the matter of personal property unless the value is greater than $3,000. You have your right to trial by jury, and no royal titles or any other title from any other country could be held by an individual. That was Massachusetts. 9 recommendations. Then you get to Virginia on June 27, 1788. The largest anti-federalist majority of any state. They were led by Patrick Henry. They made the most detailed list of rights to be protected and how to word the amendments. They came up with 20 suggestions of rights to be protected and 20 suggested amendments. And, unfortunately, it's a point of the times they were living in. But the only negative that's ever mentioned about their recommendations is the fact that in Virginia they do differentiate between slaves and free people. There are a couple rights that Virginia believed had to be protected. The proper and natural right to bear arms. Not even Massachusetts got that one. Go figure. Trial by jury, religious freedom, and free and frequent elections. Virginia wanted to hold congressional elections every year. They believed that congressmen should serve 1-year term. Now, unfortunately, today that would mean that we'd get about 3 months of work done, which probably actually wouldn't hurt right now. But every year they wanted to have elections. Now, there are amendments. Here are some amendments they proposed. The journals and proceedings of Congress shall be published at least once a year. State militia to be trained, armed, and organized by the state and not controlled in any event by the federal government. And Congress cannot alter, modify, or interfere with the times, places, or manner of holding elections. That would really help if you wanted to actually keep voter ID law out of the courts. Because then they cannot interfere with your elections and the way in which you hold them. And then you get to the crazy state of New York, July 26, 1788. The New York Convention had a slight Anti-Federalist majority. The Federalists were led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Anti-Federalists were led by George Clinton, no relation to Bill. But, now New York, and I gotta say, did not surprise me, and I realized they did not suggest, they actually came up with a list of demands, and they came up with the largest list of proposed amendments. Now, New York came up with 42 proposed amendments. 42 proposed amendments is no longer proposing amendments, that's rewriting a whole document. You ever have a contract and someone says, I have 42 points of contention with what you said, you effectively tell that person, well, you write whatever you want, send it to me, and we'll go from there. Here were a couple of their points, one that Shane mentioned. New York said in the Constitution, no president shall serve for more than 2 terms. That came up in 1788. It took us 44 terms of FDR to get that one right. Congress shall publish a journal of their proceedings, and Congress shall be open to the public. Now here's one that is very prophetic, very interesting, and I'm going to get in a little bit about this one. No money shall be borrowed on the credit of the nation without a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate. Alexander Hamilton believed in this is economically very true. Alexander Hamilton believed that if you want to grow a national economy, you have to be able to borrow money on credit. And to do that, you have to have what he would call what he did refer to as manageable debt. Now, manageable debt is paying your cell phone bill on time, making your mortgage payment, your car payment, and not being late. That's manageable debt. Manageable debt is my ability to pay my mortgage on my house, not go up to Paradise Valley, buy a $20 million home I really can't afford, and then stiff the bank. What Alexander Hamilton would say today is, what on earth are you thinking? This is not the monstrosity he foresaw when he talked about manageable debt, when he talked about a national economy. This is not it. The difference was that what you can't necessarily argue against is when the Anti-Federalist said, you are going to eventually be dead. Thomas Jefferson would say, God willing. People don't realize this. George Washington, first president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson resigned out of frustration from the Washington administration because of George Washington's inability to control Alexander Hamilton, in his opinion. Okay? People don't realize this. As great a leader as George Washington was, Thomas Jefferson said no mas. Also, not to delve into this too much, but I'll just throw this out there, see what you guys want to kick around with. Must be a natural-born citizen to hold national office. No tax on growth, production, or manufacturing. Where does the government have the right to come to your business and say, you produced that, you sold it, I produce X, I sell it to you, you give me the money for it. Where on earth does the government come in to say, where's my piece? Right, well, that was the Anti-Federalist who said nowhere. You don't have a right. And here became those points where you'd say, what is the role of the government to produce a national economy with national strength, national goals, or to protect in every way you can the rights and freedoms of the individual citizen? And then, of course, the famous one that got wrapped into the 10th Amendment, powers not granted to the government reside with the people. Not the state, the people. They just bypassed the state. And as I said, it's been downhill ever since in New York. So you get to the framing of the Bill of Rights. The Constitution is adopted. It's going to be the government. It's going to be how we're moving forward. But the amendments have to be adopted by Congress. So, and people don't realize that the first thing that the Congress did was they went about adopting eventually, the Federalists agreed. We'll give you your Bill of Rights if you will just stop. James Madison took the list of proposed amendments, of which there were legion. So he takes these proposed amendments by the states and consolidates them by idea. Because he realized a lot of these states were proposing similar language. James Madison introduces the amendments to the Constitution on June 8, 1789. Now the funny thing is this, Madison actually opposed the Bill of Rights. He didn't just think it wasn't necessary, he actually flat opposed them. He introduced them because he did actually, and this might have been the first and last time this ever happened, but he actually honored a campaign promise. And he said he would try to pass them. So, Madison proposed to interweave the amendments into the Constitution. Because what he did not want to do is this. He did not want to have a Bill of Rights that was longer than the Constitution. That was one thing he was not willing to do. The vast majority of Federalists were opposed to adding the amendments after the election and adoption of the Constitution as is. So your Federalists even said, look, we got the thing passed, we got it approved, we got the states on board, let's just pass the Constitution and sorry you guys lost, elections have consequences. Okay? Because as they said, it was almost as it was seen by some of the Federalists as insulting to their personal honor that you would think that I'm going to take your rights away. What kind of person do you think I am? And again, the Anti-Federalists always said, our problem is not with you bunch. It's your great-grandchildren and your great-great-grandchildren who are not going to understand what necessary and proper means, who are not going to understand what general welfare means, and they're going to twist it. So, Madison comes up with a couple amendments, kind of coming up with it, and then Roger Sherman from Connecticut decides to come up with a couple amendments. He came up with 11 ideas to the Constitution that he believed would help Madison push this through, help quell some of the concerns of the Federalists. Unfortunately, the Federalists didn't listen to him. So pretty much we get to the conference committee. You have the House of Representatives passed 17 amendments. The Senate passes 12. They compromise on 12 amendments taking parts of both the House and the Senate proposals. This happens on September 28, 1789. There are 12 amendments passed. The states ratify 10. Those 10 become your Bill of Rights that you know of. But here are the 12. One representative for every 30,000. Any congressional salary increase will not take effect until the following Congress takes office. They at least figured that one out. Freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petitioning the government. That's wrapped up into one amendment. The right to bear arms. No soldier, and we know the Bill of Rights. There's one thing I wanted in particular to mention real quick, and I wanted to get the exact language right, and that is, where is Virginia's proposed amendment for gun rights? They had a very interesting one, and as I said, it was a very, how do I say it? Sometimes you have a point, and then it just sort of disappears on you, because that's Virginia for you. Oh, here's the 42 proposed things. Here we go. Where is it? Okay, yes, Virginia was the one. They actually came up with this one, that each state respectively shall have the power to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining its own militia whenever Congress shall omit or neglect to provide for the same. So if the federal government is going to protect the state, then the state has the obligation to protect itself. Someone should send that to Phoenix and see what we'll do at the border. Where is the one? I know this one, and it's really... When you get to my age, it's really tough to read all this stuff.
He's a kid.
So, all right, there is the actual amendment. I'm not making it up. I know this. Okay, and I'm just not finding it. That's very, very unfortunate. But pretty much, I'll just put it this way. Virginia believed in its proposed amendment, easy for me to say, which Richard Henry Lee took the lead on, pretty much believed that it was your natural, and without question, it was your right. When you actually look it up, and I would implore you to look up Richard Henry Lee on the Second Amendment and look at the original language, because they believed that it was your natural right to own a firearm. They did not talk about a militia. They did not talk about that. Your original Second Amendment was very specifically about the relationship between the individual citizen and their firearms. It was very different. Our Second Amendment, as strong as it is, in our opinion, as it's written and adopted, was not what it could have been. One of the other big issues that the Anti-Federalists brought up was, because what the Federalists said was, you can amend this. If you don't like something in it, amend it, change it, add to it, if you think we got it wrong. Well, the problem is that your Anti-Federalists said, wait, to amend something, we need 3/4 of the states to do this. You've practically made it impossible not to add good stuff, but to remove bad stuff. And there were a lot of questions they had because, again, as they said, the Articles of Confederacy were working except tweaking it. So as I said, when looking into the Anti-Federalists, the question was not, is the Constitution a failure? Patrick Henry would probably say, yes, it is. But the Constitution, the biggest thing in the Federalist Papers that they keep harping on is the need for the citizens to be involved and the need for the government to actually follow the blueprint. The Constitution, as it was adopted with the Bill of Rights, was by far the best document for governing a country if that was the way we were going to go forward. It was the best thing you could come up with. And we've just completely, and I don't need to tell everybody here, okay, what has happened. But here's the thing. It didn't just start 6 years ago. It didn't start 100 years ago. Let's go back to the second president of the United States, John Adams. John Adams passes the Alien and Sedition Laws, which said that it was a crime to challenge the authority of the federal government in times of war. We couldn't get out the starting block without someone trying to tweak it and change it and do all of that. So the biggest thing that we can do, I believe, is not looking at the Federalists as the bad guys. They were not the bad guys. George Washington was not a bad guy. That list, Alexander Hamilton and manageable debt, that's just how it works. If you don't believe me, don't pay your cell phone bill. See what happens. Okay? Having manageable debt is healthy. It's what builds credit. It's what builds your reputation. That's good stuff. What the Tea Party I see and what attracted me to the Tea Party was the fact that there is that strain from the Anti-Federalists that says, yeah, but. You say, Reagan famously joked about the worst words in the English language, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. The reason why, it's because of this attitude from the Anti-Federalists, is what makes that a funny statement. Because in Europe, they believe it. Use it. I'm from the government and I'm here to help is not a joke in France or Italy or Germany or Britain. It's not a joke. In Canada, it's not a joke. Here it is. And it's here because we have it, and it's embedded in our culture to have a watchful eye, or at least a distrusting eye, of the actions of our government. When looking at it, we were always taught in school, and I know someone just said I'm a kid, and you know, relative to some of the people here, yes. But I'll say this. When I went to school, I was taught about the Federalists. I was taught about the Constitution. The Constitution was adopted because our prior form of government was a failure. That's how it was packaged to me. Everyone here was practically taught in one way, shape, or another. The Constitution was that was it. Everything before that was just a mess leading up to us figuring this out. Well, when you actually look at it, now we can argue later on about whether or not you have an education system today that actually wants to integrate this kind of education into our system today, because who wants kids thinking about challenging the government? But when you look at it, you say the Anti-Federalists brought up so many valid points. Well, most people in this country didn't pay attention to debt and borrowing against debt and the credit of the nation and all this stuff until auto bailouts and stimulus packages and all of this massive, crazy spending. No one ever thought about it. 200 years ago, it was common sense to a group of people who said, wait a minute, this is ridiculous. You can't, where's the controls on this? Who's printing the money? Who's spending it? Who's selling our debt? These were all issues that were brought up 200 years ago. And I know I was asked to at least end this on sort of a point of action, as opposed to just making everyone feel depressed, and that wasn't the goal at all. No, we're not depressed. But, because there is an answer. Shane did mention I did run for office, and one of the questions I was asked was, what did I think of the Convention of States that's been going on? And I always brought up 2 points. One, I said, look at the fact that we have had this happen before. We have had a convention held before. And just, if there's one thing, if anything, I have learned in my life in politics is that there is no set rules. And everyone can always say, this has never happened. Just like the Federalist said, your representatives, why would your representative ever try to screw you? So, he's a senator. He'll be the first to remind you he's a senator, not a representative.
I knew that. It was just so.
He's
still in Congress. It just, Jeff, sure. He's still, yeah, exactly. He's a member of Congress.
So, the action point is this. When we talk about an issue like the Convention of States, or what amendments to propose, or what it is, I'll just say this. Back in the beginning, when people far smarter, in my opinion, than the average participant in our government today, as far as local officials, federal officials, I'll take Patrick Henry and George Washington any day over, not just the Democrats, but most of the Republicans. And I'll say this. There are a number of amendments that the Anti-Federalists wrote almost 200 plus years ago that were never considered, that were never looked at, that were just pushed aside because it was a political inconvenience. And I would say that before proposing our own amendments and having people today that I don't hold in nearly the same esteem as I would hold Patrick Henry or any one of our other founding fathers, I would say let's pull the amendments out of the dustbin that they were shoved in and start looking at those and start seeing what kind of policies we can promote that they figured out way back when. I'll tell you what, people say balanced budget amendment. I'll tell you what, Arizona has a balanced budget amendment. Doesn't quite work. But I'll say this. If you had a bill that was 2/3 vote on whether or not you could borrow money against the credit of the nation, that one, under these circumstances, granted, we'll have some people who would say no, but those are the kinds of things. Look, you don't want to go backwards, you want to go forwards, but there are a lot of great ideas that were prophetic in their time, and so I would say let's at least not forget The Anti-Federalists were not the bad guys. They had a lot of good ideas to promote responsible, limited government. Thank you. I'm being chased off the stage. I appreciate it very much.